next speaker is Alison Smith Bramlet from the University of Georgia, and teaches in landscape architecture. Is going to be talking about informal networks. So,
Thank
Alison.
you. Hi, this is actually quite interesting that I'm following this one up because there's a lot of similarities in terms of looking at the network and the overland and how to start to combine that. So this project is, it's called Informal Networks, and it's mapping homeless spatial patterns. And what we're doing here is I'll be presenting a process and findings from an examination of homeless populations and spatial patterns of use in the informal networks in Athens, Georgia. Just to give you a little background about Athens in terms of the poverty and homeless situation. The poverty rate in Athens is the 5th highest in the nation. In terms of the poverty level, it's about it's 34.9%, and the state of Georgia is 17.4%. So there's definitely poverty. In terms of actual homeless, the county actually has about twice the amount of homeless residents than relative to the national average. So so there's definitely an issue here that we have to think about in terms of how these folks are moving across our landscape. So just to give you an idea of what we're considering informal networks. So a formal network for this study is a designated route that's utilized by, or designed to be utilized by pedestrians, such as a sidewalk or road. An informal route are these kind of spaces and connections that aren't specifically designated for pedestrian movement, but they tend to be used sometimes in terms of infrastructure corridors such as rail right-of-way, parking lots, natural systems along floodplains, vacant lands, and essentially these edge spaces. And so what we have here actually is what I decided to include this because this was my route yesterday. I went to the City Engine workshop at the Learning Center over here. And when I was walking back to my hotel for lunch, I realized that my walking directions on my phone told me just to go up Redlands and then come up Tennessee and go to Colton. But when I started doing that, the sidewalk ended here, and there was a retaining wall on the other side of the road. And then there ended up being a lot of bushes, and so it was very hard to walk there. So I was able to jump along the rail corridor and just use that to get to Tennessee, and then I was able to just kind of cut through some parking lots and get to the hotel. So while this is what the map told me to do, this was my GPS app on my phone, and this is actually what I did. So this diagram here is just kind of showing how the formal route and the informal route can work together, and that can kind of become this network. So the dark blue areas are what I consider formal, or along the road, along the sidewalk. And these light blue areas are walking across a parking lot or walking across the rail right of way. And then we have those intersections. And what happens at those intersections is quite interesting. So in terms of background about this study, this began in a studio in 2010 that was run by Professor Douglas Pardue, and who's also a co-author on this. And he did this Informal Athens studio, which was a graduate design studio that focused on 5 different homeless locations in Athens. And they called them the Athens 5. And they went through and obviously did a complete inventory analysis and identified settlement patterns, key information, started to look at actually some of these correlations, trends. But the thing that's interesting about this is that the scale of this was site-specific. And so they were looking at each one of these individual encampments. And so the way that our research is now, we're going beyond the site, and now we're looking at the network of Athens itself and how all of these are interrelated and connected together. So in terms of the goal of this, is simply to better understand the homeless spatial patterns of mobility. We we need to identify the existing services and encampments, identify the existing networks, the service areas, and the gaps, start to identify preferred networks and routes, and then start to look at the similarities and the differences between these types of routes, and start to foresee opportunities here. So this slide here is just simply our needs. So we obviously need to understand our existing services and encampments at this point. And so your red dots are the existing services that are within Athens for homeless. And the triangles are the existing encampments that we know. These things are constantly shifting and changing, so it's one of our limitations of the study. We may not know every encampment. But if you notice, the ones that are in the darker orange are the ones that are considered active as of now. The ones in the lighter pale yellow are vacated at this point. And there's a variety of reasons for that. The primary reason of that is renewed interest in urban development is displacing some of these. And so what's happening is that these former encampments are being pushed to the periphery of the town. So the next step, once we had that inventory and we have all of our services and all of our encampments, we started to just run a general network analysis. So let's look at our service shed and start to understand what is covered with the current services. And you'll notice that the dots are actually, they're a proportional symbol. In addition to just identifying the services, we also identified all of the things offered there. So proportionally larger has a variety of different services. So we can see the network analysis shed here that's a quarter and a half mile and a mile. And we start to see that there's clearly areas that are not within that. You can definitely tell that a lot of these areas are not being able to access that anymore. And so what's important about that is out of the 16 encampments, 9 of them are within 1 mile of the existing services. But only 3 out of the 9 active encampments are actually within 1 mile. But 6 out of the 7 encampments that used to be active but were forced to be vacated for a variety of reasons are in that service shed. So we're having a situation where displacement's occurring and there's not access. So in terms of being able to kind of get this hybrid or understand, how do we start to look at the way that people walk through a city beyond just networks? We first started with just looking at terrain and just kind of the pure overland path, but realized that this is not going to work because it doesn't consider land use, it doesn't consider any of the things and the constraints that we would need to consider. It's simply considering slope at this point. So what we did to overcome this was create a hybrid method. And our hybrid analysis method utilized the cost surface of slope, but we began to identify preferred lands. And when I say preferred lands, these were lands that, in terms of research and observation, these are those patterns that we've seen that homeless prefer. Right-of-ways, close to water, floodplains, undeveloped lands, impervious surfaces, including parking lots, essentially removing out any private property, any single-family residential, and starting to put all of that together and create what we call, this is just a mask. And so essentially all of these were combined into one data layer, which creates this mask. And then this is used to extract by mask from our original slope raster, which is then used as the cost surface for the least cost path analysis. So the results of that give us something that looks like this. And what we start to see is, we see that we've got these networks here, and a lot of them actually do run along roads, which is quite interesting. And to better understand this, because this was run from all the encampments to all of the services, so you're definitely going to have overlap of these things. And so to better understand this, went ahead and did a weighted overlay of all of the least cost path analysis and weighted them equally so we could start to see what are the most frequented routes, what are the least. So again, you can start to see this in comparison here with the other method. And while here we see, yes, this is the service shed and these are the things that are being accessed, we're able here to really not only consider just the roads, because this hybrid method did consider the road right of way, but we're also considering all of these other things that we know that we use. And so what that ends up getting to is something that looks a little like this. We can start to see some of these areas where we've got things that are circled in black, and these are areas that ended up being kind of nodes of areas that do not use road networks. But we definitely had some clear patterns in terms of things that were not surprising. I was definitely not surprised that this road Prince here was utilized by multiple encampments to get to multiple services. Many of these are because the services are clustered there anyway. Some of these were definitely surprising in terms of utilizing this road here, the plaza, and some other roads as well. So there were definitely some surprises, but there are some of them were what you would expect. I think one of the more surprises about the informal paths in terms of things we did expect, such as we definitely expected clusters along the greenway, even though the greenway itself wasn't actually a line considered in there. Because of all of the other data layers, I was not surprised by that. But what I was surprised about was these multiple routes that start to cut through campus. There's definitely a huge area here that's just cutting all through campus. Up in here as well, cutting through campus. This one's actually cutting through the parks. And here, there's a lot of them actually using these informal paths in downtown, so going through parking lots and traversing all of that area. So in terms of the next steps of what we would like to do with this analysis, clearly it needs to be refined and start to understand what these patterns are really telling us. In addition to just visually identifying these high priorities, we want to get to quantification of that and start to understand the potential of where services could be located. If we know certain high priority areas already exist. We also want to investigate what's happening at these intersections of formal and informal. And that's where a process like this can get back down to that site scale. What's going on here where people are walking and doing all these things, and how can we make that connection of the formal to the informal, and how can we use that as engagement points? We also would like to actually engage the homeless with these maps and get their feedback in terms of, these are our hypothetical routes. We also have observed routes through GPS that we went to every site, walked routes, but we don't know all the paths that they take through the entire city. So being able to put the maps in front of folks and get feedback on that would be great. And in addition, beyond that, we'd like to start to influence some of the planning policies that currently are going on, because a lot of these policies don't necessarily take into consideration spatial factors when they're thinking about services for homeless. So it really does actually seem to be an important aspect of it. So with that, I'd just like to say thanks to the Urban Outreach Studio, and thank you for letting me present.